Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pie, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by John O'Brien MBE, the founder of Anthropy. Before creating one of the largest gatherings of future makers in the UK, John has had an incredible career path, from serving as an army officer to leading major initiatives with the Prince of Wales's charities. He's now embarked on an ambitious mission to bring together leaders from across sectors to help build a better Britain. Join me as we explore John's perspective on creating new platforms, purpose and impact, adaptability, transferable skills, and the pivotal moments that have shaped his journey in life. It's a real delight to have you on Pivot Points today, John. Just to get us going, why don't you give our listeners a little sense of your journey and some of the pivotal moments in your life?
Well, thanks, Dave, and it's great to be here. Yeah, I mean, I suppose to put it into context, I'm of a certain age. I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s in Shropshire, which is a rural county, obviously in England.
So you're a baby boomer.
Well, yes, I'm just sort of in that category, and sort of therefore get the blame for everything that's wrong in the world, like every other baby boomer. So now we're trying to put things right, I guess. But
that's brilliant.
Yeah, but I mean, my background was small market town. My parents were small business people. Both sets of grandparents lived in the same town, were also small business people. And I was sort of destined for that route. I didn't go to university. I left school. The idea was, I think it was my parents' idea, was that I go get a proper job in inverted commas, get a few years experience of that, and then move potentially into one of the family businesses. And so I joined Lloyds Bank and I became a bank clerk in the retail side in Shropshire. The first pivotal and a major pivotal thing that occurred, though, was that actually during my first couple of years in banking, one of the managers was actually in the Territorial Army, the reserve forces of the time. And as a young chap in my late teens, early 20s, he said, why don't you consider going and having a look at it? And I did. I joined the army, or rather I joined the reserve army, the TA, thoroughly enjoyed it. And after a couple of years, I found that actually I was looking forward to my weekends more so than my weeks. I actually enjoyed the soldiering more than banking. So the first significant thing which really changed my life entirely and everything subsequent was to decide to go and join the army, which I did at the age of 21. And spent 10 years as an infantry officer all around the world. And that was the biggest pivotal decision that I've made, which has effectively changed the direction of my life.
I mean, that's a huge pivotal moment. And I mean, it must have taken a lot of courage to change. What did your parents think of that?
It was a very difficult time, to be perfectly frank. My father is not here anymore, but at the time, there was quite a lot of angst, to put it lightly. And I think it was a combination of, obviously, the sort of idea of what I might be doing had changed. And also, to be perfectly realistic, I took the decision, I made the action and told them after the event, which was, frankly, not really anything that I'd done before in my life. And I did that because I knew that it would be a problem. So I actually sort of did it and then told them about it, which is quite a challenge.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an enormous amount of courage and to sort of do that at 21 and to sort of take that on, amazing. And did that decision work out? Did you think that the 10 years in the army, gave you what you wanted and what you thought you would get?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say sort of moving on, of course, my parents then became incredibly supportive once they knew, the rationale and the decision was what I was going to do. And became very proud. I mean, from my perspective, I went obviously to Sandhurst. I got commissioned. I wasn't exactly the first of my family to go to Sandhurst. We'd had somebody in the family who'd been an officer in the First World War, but it was a very different thing. We weren't a military family or anything. But the army actually worked out tremendously well. And I think one can go into the detail of what it gave me. But as a young person, when I look back particularly, the amount of responsibility one had as in my early 20s, like every other army officer, was just extraordinary. You don't really appreciate it at the time, but actually the sheer amount of responsibility for the equipment, for the lives of your men, for the situations you're in and the decisions you make in places that were combat zones and various things like that is an extraordinary responsibility for people in their early 20s. And I've often looked back with friends of mine from the army who, as you get older, you look back and you think, my goodness, however did we do that? Actually, we were incredibly, obviously trained by the army, but you still look back and think, it's quite an extraordinary responsibility to be had.
Mm. Did that sort of responsibility at an early age, do you think that sort of stood you in good stead for the rest of your life?
It did, but I think more, to be perfectly frank, I'm sure, one can get responsibility in other professions and things. The thing that transformed my ability to be effective in the rest of my life was actually the specific military training I had. I don't mean about shooting weapons and things like that, but the army is very good actually at selecting officers to go into the specialisms that are probably most pertaining to their characteristics, I'll put it that way. And I was an infantry officer. Now, that's not an engineer, it's not a signals officer or somewhere. It's a sophisticated requirement to learn about things. But infantry officers are trained fundamentally to go into, at short notice, to go into really volatile, uncertain, complicated situations, make a rapid assessment of that situation, formulate a plan, communicate that plan effectively, and then lead it to fruition. And I think that's the critical skill set that I was given.
So did that make you great at execution? Because you're a man of action as opposed to talking.
Well, I've had to learn how to talk, and people would say I probably do a lot of talking, but I think that more so, I mean, certainly, obviously it's no good talking about things and not being able to execute. But the reality is that I think the biggest element of it is the assessment of it, the need. What is the need? The ability to then take information from wherever and formulate something that makes sense. But the critical thing is that you can't do it on your own. So you've got to be able to communicate it to others. And if that's a small platoon of men going into a volatile situation, that's one thing. But if in later life, that's about communicating to clients or communicating to a wider stakeholder group or communicating, even to media or the general public, you've got to be able to do that effectively. So I think the communication element is critical, as well as the sort of formulation of execution. I think people that have worked with me over the years would probably say that I'm good at execution, but probably not so good on the detail. My natural inclination is more the sort of visionary or the wider sweep, and let's get this done and let's work out how to do it as we go.
So your next pivotal moment must have been to decide to leave the army, because you could have stayed in there for a lifetime. So you're 31 and coming out the army, are you?
Well, I was, but the critical thing that was different was that I didn't make the choice to go out of the army. I wanted to stay in the army. So what happened was that I'd been in 10 years or 9.5 years or whatever. And of course, we effectively won the Cold War. And so the Berlin Wall came down, the Warsaw Pact was disemboweled, etc. And the British Army, over a period of 2 years, the government decided to reduce it by 47,000. So 47,000 of us was told, thanks very much, you're gone.
Wow.
Yeah, nobody knows about this because, of course, if it was an industry like the steel industry or the coal industry and 47,000 men, predominantly men, were made redundant over a period of 2 years, the country would have been, gosh, what's happening? But it was seen as a benefit of the Cold War. 47,000 of us were reduced. It was one of the most traumatic things I've had to do because there were some voluntary redundancies because people were, some soldiers wanted to leave, some officers wanted to leave, but there were an awful lot of people like myself who were well thought of. We'd had good track records. I was doing serious jobs, etc. And they just took a massive slice of the arm and said, thank you very much. So I would have stayed in for another 8 to 10 years minimum. I saw myself as a career army officer. And on one day I was given my papers. I made no bones about it. I went back to my home, which was, of course, an army-issued house. My wife was still at work. I went in and I sat on the steps of the house, or went in, sat on the stairs, and I just felt the world had crumbled. Even though I knew the redundancies were coming, by virtue of my track record, how well I was thought of, the jobs I'd done. I had no idea that it was going to affect me.
And how did you get over that moment of self-pity and pick yourself up and go, God, because that's a tough moment. That's a really deep, pivotal moment.
Yeah, and it's deep also for people that don't understand or served in the military. It wasn't just losing a job. So firstly, it meant that we'd lost the family.
You've lost a life.
Yeah, we'd lost our home. So within 6 months or so, I'd have to find a job. We'd have to move out of the army house and find a new house somewhere. We lost our social life because you're entirely in a world of your own. And that's not just the friends that I have, but all the wives of officers, etc., are also very much in a close-knit network because when we, the men, served away, the women supported each other. But also, most importantly, to be perfectly frank, my whole sense of purpose and my whole self-esteem was based on being a British Army officer. I'd been all around the world, stood for something. And I remember thinking to myself, if I'm not an army officer, what am I? And I just could not instantly understand what I would really see as my self-worth, my sort of position in society. So it was a great shock. Now, the army at the time were sort of created opportunities for you to do what we call resettlement courses, which were courses to go and look at business management and things like that. And I went on a business management course, which gave me an MVQ sort of thing, whatever. But to be perfectly frank, what was more supportive was that I phoned up a good friend of mine who had left the army of his own volition about 2 years before. So he had only been in for a short term. He wanted to leave. He left. And I phoned him up and I said, look, how do I cope with this? What do I do? Mm. And he was extremely supportive as a friend, but also the best advice I got from him was, John, you've got one mission, talking military, you've got one mission ahead of you now, which is find the job. Your mission is to find the job. And he said, it doesn't matter what job it is. It's a job to land in civilian street, land on the job. And then you can determine where, what, how, but get yourself something so that you don't have this period where you're lost and always looking back. And I got quite serious about that. I, read books about getting work. I networked. I probably created, different networks and things like that. I even exceptionally went and got a business card printed. There was nothing on it but my name. There were no such things, of course. People would realize there were no such thing as emails. There was no internet.
Yeah.
So I literally had my name. I decided to put my regimental cap badge on it. And I couldn't put my phone number on it because, of course, we were moving house. So, but when I went anywhere, I just myself started to give cards out. And I would write on the phone number that I had at the time on the back. So I went into that mission-orientated, what is it? But the one other piece of learning, which was really my own decision, which I think is relevant to people in other walks of life, was that for 10 years in the army and being married, and my wife coming into that environment as well, when you get an order to go somewhere, you do it. The job comes absolutely first. The family follows. We had to move. We were separated for times, things of that kind. But I decided that the next decision wouldn't be a work-based decision. It would be a life-based decision. So at that time, and I certainly got a couple of offers, there were opportunities coming to army officers. So I was a captain. There were opportunities coming to captains to go into the city through regimental connections, old school networks, etc. People were happily taking captains into roles in foreign exchange, banking, things of that kind. And I thought, actually, if I'm going for the job, that's the direction to go. A lot of people did that. I'm sure they've been tremendously happy. But my wife and I both come from Shropshire, and we were about to try and start a family. And we thought if we want to start a family, we want to do that where our parents are, near the sort of environment that we grew up in, the countryside, etc. So I actually decided to take a job, of all places, in Liverpool so that we could live in Chester and be closer to our families in Shropshire. And it was a life decision rather than perhaps a professional decision in my place. And there have been other pivotal points since then, but I think it was a far better decision to make there than just chase after what was the offer of a job in foreign exchange or an offer in banking and go directly into that, as opposed to just making a life decision and taking an unusual role in Liverpool.
And what was the job you took?
So again, through one of these army networks, etc., that are there for supporting officers coming out, I actually became the development director of a medical research charity and institution based out of the University of Liverpool. And I did that for 2 years. And I found that actually, again, going back to communication, I found that I was very good at understanding the complexity of medical research, bizarrely, not a world I knew, that I could turn that complexity into simplified language. Firstly, so I could understand it. I need to simplify these things so I could understand it, but then simplify it and communicate it to potential donors, foundations, pharmaceutical companies and things like that to try and get their financial support. And, a lot of luck involved. I did prove to be rather good at that. And I, in 2 years, increased the income of that charity tenfold, which was quite extraordinary at that time. That funded a new institute at the University of Liverpool. And I was asked by the trustees to take over as CEO when the incumbent decided to retire. So I spent 4 years in total there, and that was quite interesting as a job to land. I suppose learn that my military skills of communication could work and the management of a smallish organization worked. And that was a reinvention of myself.
Yeah, I mean, I that's a brilliant story, and that sort of ability to persuade people and take people with you and get them to either run up the hill or give money towards medical research. It's a core skill. And how did you sort of then move on? And because you've now moved into, I think the charitable sector is one of the most competitive sectors I've ever sort of come across. The competition for the giving competition is incredibly tough. Again, you're sort of learning some very harsh life lessons, but they must have helped you sort of get to the point where you take your next step in life.
Yes, I mean, the next step, funny enough, was a complete disaster. I mean, it's the worst job I've ever had in my life.
You probably learned more there than any other.
Well, you've always got to realize that there's the value of the experience. And so essentially at that time, there was an initiative led by Tony Blair called Modernization of Local Government. And local government was being encouraged to bring in people from outside the traditional local government pool to try and create more innovative thinking and things like that. And I was approached and was offered a role as a director at a city in the north of England, which will remain nameless because I don't want to besmirch the colleagues, etc., that will be there. But it also allowed us to relocate to Shropshire from a family perspective. And so I went into that role, but I found local government to be absolutely an alien environment for my natural characteristics. It was lacking in any sort of entrepreneurial sort of opportunity or spirit. It was a hung local authority between different political parties. You couldn't get anything done. It was incredibly frustrating. And I have no doubt that I was an incredibly frustrating colleague to all those other people that had to work for me. And I was going insane probably by 6 months.
Yeah, I can see why. As a man who likes to get things done, that would just drive you nuts.
I mean, it was crazy. But the good thing was I was director responsible for inward investment of grants and government funding and things of that kind to actually get involved in regeneration projects, the built environment, a whole host of things in that area. So it equipped me for the next job I applied for, which was to join one of the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, Prince of Wales's charities called Business in the Community, which was the largest responsible business network led by the Prince of Wales, or the King when he was Prince of Wales, about engaging business on what we would have then called CSR. And so I don't think I'd have been able to secure that role as a director of BITC if I hadn't had the experience of the regeneration funded programs and things that I led at the city council. So there's always some advantage to that. And that I think is probably the next pivotal point, because I then spent 10 years working very closely with the Prince of Wales and his interests as part of the organisation, engaging significant business on their impact on society, both domestically and internationally. I launched projects in India, Pakistan, Canada, across the Muslim world for him as well. And it also gave me extraordinary insight into different aspects of both business and also what else was happening in society, because the Prince's interests, King's interests, were so broad. They'd cover everything from education to food and farming to how business operates, diversity, the whole thing. So I was suddenly immersed in this huge agenda, literally picking up memos and phone calls, from the Prince of Wales, and then being the person that was actually, in a very military way, really going out, assessing a situation that he'd become concerned about. So it might be the state of hill farms or It might be the state of inner city schools or something. I would go and assess the information, formulate a plan that might engage business to support an intervention. Then I would have to, with obviously his convening power, go and communicate that possibility to those business leaders, and then hopefully build something that would have an impact. And that was an extraordinary period of 10 years. And, that was the next learning experience. But again, totally based upon my skills given to me through the army.
Mm. And is that where you sort of learned the power of inspiration? Because that ability to bring the power of the Prince of Wales as he was then and business together to do good things, you've got to inspire.
You have. And actually, the biggest thing was that the Prince of Wales obviously had extraordinary convening ability. I mean, on the 10 years, I've sat around tables with him, with heads of state, with people like Al Gore, with the big global business leaders and all the rest of it. And the Prince would be able to get them into the room. But the question is then, once you've got them there, how do you inspire them to not just sort of walk away thinking, oh, that was a nice meeting, but we're actually going to do something? And that fell into two things. Whenever I looked at anything, I had to look at the business case. It could not be corporate philanthropy. I mean, in some instances, it had to be probably, but in the vast majority of cases, you had to look at why is a business in this for its own, in a way, enlightened self-interest. So you were looking at finding the business case to support the reduction of homelessness, or finding the business case to support the STEM agenda in schools, or whatever the case may be. Once you'd got that, that was obviously ticking a lot of boxes with business leaders. But the second thing was to connect them with people who are working on the front line. Because actually the greatest inspiration was for them to be taken into an inner city school and meet the most extraordinary inspirational head teacher, managing all the challenges that an inner city school might have. And those business leaders would be humbled when they looked at the complexity of some of the things that were being done. And often it was the inspiration from the community leaders, the social sort of leaders, the people running civic institutions that would help add on to the convening ability of the Prince of Wales, the business case, the inspiration coming, from them. And that was a winning formula. And I actually, one of the initiatives that I ran was something called Seeing is Believing, where we took hundreds and hundreds of significant business leaders all around the UK on specific issues and visits onto things. So you take, for example, the then CEOs of all the supermarkets, led by Sir Peter Davis when he was leading Sainsbury's as an example, and you take them all onto some hill farms where they would understand for the first time the marginality of the impact of squeezing the price on milk or something like that. And of course, the convening ability of the Prince of Wales meant that they all knew that 3 months later they were expected to go and meet him in St. James's Palace and tell him what they were going to do about it. So that's quite a forceful way of doing it. Yeah,
that's very powerful, and it feels like we could do with a bit of that mobilization of learning again in the country at the moment. It feels like people have lost touch with some of the pressures that we put on society, and we put particularly farmers with everything that this government seems to be doing to farmers.
Absolutely.
But let's not get political, because that's not a good place to go. Let's sort of fast forward a bit and talk a bit about Anthropy, because that's a huge decision in your life to, how did you come up with the idea?
Yeah, so back in 2010, I decided after 10 years, it was time to move on from the Prince's charities. A little bit of an intro was that I went and saw him and I explained I was going to depart, thinking he'd say, well, thanks very much, John, off you go. Actually, he was a little bit upset to lose me and decided actually, well, what was I going to do? And I explained I was going to venture into creating my own business. And I suppose, in a way, coming from as I said at the start, all my family had been in business, or different retail and things like that. I just thought there's a niche there I need to try and do. And as you know, I ventured into that space with the Prince of Wales actually becoming, my first client of things. But so for 7 years, we did advisory work looking at going what I would call beyond CSR into what is now described as ethical purpose. And I'd had some success in that. And I'd written, a very successful book that was a Forbes top 15 and number 3 at WH Smith's back in 2017. But at that point, I got the opportunity to actually move that thinking, et cetera, into Omnicom, the global marketing group. And so I had been commuting from my home in Shropshire down to London for many, many years, about 17 years. I then transitioned into very much a corporate role, guiding a group of businesses and supporting their efforts with clients. And then COVID hit. And so suddenly, after 17 years of commuting weekly to London, I, like so many other people, were then at home, working from home, but obviously isolated to a great extent in whatever our environments were. Now, during that first year of COVID, there were a number of factors that came to play in my thinking. The first was that I was very conscious of the impact it was having on our businesses in the group that I was co-leading. I was also very concerned because of my history about the social impact that COVID was going to be happening in the UK on everything from education, mental health, things of that kind. And I was worried about, well, how does the economy come back from this and how does society come back from this? I also lost a couple of friends to COVID in the first few months. That was a bit of a shock, but men of a certain age, with health conditions would take out. So it was a time of reflection. I'd also agreed the year before to write another book that particular year of lockdown without knowing it was coming. And to be fair, the spark was that the foreword was written for me by Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, who of course has his very famous Davos gathering. And when I received that foreword in January 2021, I thought, the UK needs a sort of equivalent of Davos focused on how the UK builds back after COVID. And that was the spark of the idea. And I was just very fortunate that obviously through the work that I'd done with the Prince of Wales and my commercial relations, I was able to, I've got a reasonable black book. So I was able to communicate with people like yourself and others and say, look, is this something you feel interested in being a part of? But I think there is a need for a national gathering of leaders from all sectors to look at how we actually get this country back up and running. And I think we're not getting too political about it, but I think at that time as well, there was a general dismay on the state of British politics across all political parties. I'm not sure that's changed particularly. But if leadership and a vision for the country doesn't come from where we've traditionally looked for it, which is Westminster and Parliament, then it needs to come from somewhere else. And I'm a great believer it must come from the leaders of the organizations that are actually doing things in this country. But that's how the idea came about.
And how did you sort of go from idea to getting, what was it, 1,200 people to go to Cornwall to the Eden Project for 3 days?
Yes,
because that's the mobilization par excellence, if ever there was one. And why did you put it in Cornwall? Yeah, as lovely as Cornwall is.
Yeah, well, there's a number of things there. So again, when you look back on things, and I do look back on Anthropy, you realize that actually, if I'd have known all that was required to make it happen, I'd have probably thought, forget it, because the effort was just extraordinary. I mean, it was a huge effort personally, both financially, in terms of my time, energy. I think my health was affected by it, etc. Because so you need sometimes with these ideas a degree of naivety. So obviously you've got to have the idea, but if you knew all the detail about how difficult it was to set up a business or how difficult it was to launch a charity or whatever, often a lot of people who go on to do great things, if they knew all the details, they'd never do it. So it is an extraordinary thing. I don't doubt it. But of course, it's also been helped and lifted by an enormous number of people. But there were two things that happened. So the first was that when I spoke to people and people said, yes, we're interested in this, we think there's a need for it in the country, then essentially my ask to them in the first instance was not for money, although that did have to come. But my first instance was, okay, help me build what might be the agenda for the first gathering. So for a year, because another COVID outbreak meant that I had to postpone it slightly, but for 12 months, I had 250 organizations working remotely on platforms, collectively, though, determining what an agenda might be. And all I did was set the questions. And I wanted Britain to have a sort of focus on longer term thinking. So not just all this short termism all the time, but I said, what is the quality of life we want in Britain for the next 30 years, particularly with emphasis for the next generation? What is the quality of places, both our built environments and our natural environment, to support that quality of life? What are the qualities of a good economy and good business? Because that's the driver of value in our society and pays for everything, public service, etc. And finally, because I didn't want it to be Little Britain, what are the qualities we share globally to work together on big issues like climate change and poverty? And so 250 organizations working across all that agenda, formulating what might be an agenda for a gathering. The second thing, you talk about Cornwall. I was being asked to put it on in London at the Queen Elizabeth Centre in Westminster. People wanted me to take it to the Olympic Park. Some people then lobbied me to take it to Oxford. But I made a key decision, which was that I thought if I do that, it'll be like any other conference. And what will happen is that the senior leaders that we want to get there, they will come, they'll join a panel, make a speech, and then they'll go. And actually, one of the critical things about something like the Davos gathering, whether one likes it or not, or something like going to UN Global Climate Week or COP or something of that kind, is that people have to make a really serious decision to commit to go somewhere. It takes investment of time and money to get there. And also, once they're there, they're sort of stuck. So that means you can have a much broader, wider set of interactions, communication, whatever. So I thought, where is the place to do that? I thought of Cornwall. And of course, at Cornwall, there is the world-renowned Eden project, which is, for people that don't know, this extraordinary conversion of a redundant quarry, what was a big clay pit, into an extraordinary environmental and educational learning and visitor experience, with the world's largest indoor rainforest in a huge biome and another biome for a Mediterranean environment. And I thought, actually, if you can get leaders to make that serious commitment to go there and then actually put some of those conversations into an environment that is different, you've got different leaders, different environment, which will make people feel differently, not just think differently. And hopefully that will result in different types of thinking and opportunities coming out of it. So I happen to know Sir Tim Smith, the founder, and I phoned him. I said, Tim, what's it going to cost me to close Eden for 3 days to the general public and hire it? And he said, we've never done that in 25 years, John. If we do it, you'll be the first person we've ever done it with. So that was a first. But as you say, in the first year, we actually had slightly less. We had about 1,050 or so delegates for the first year. And then last year we did, the second time around, we got up to just under 2,000. It was sort of 1,850 or something like that. And we are looking at it exceeding 2,000 this next time in March.
Yeah. And when is it in March?
Yeah, so it's the 26th to the 28th of March at the Eden Project, and details can be found at www.anthropy.uk.
Brilliant. And how do you see the inspiration that's created at Anthropy going into society? I mean, you've got some very influential, powerful people who are capable of driving change. We all have our businesses, we all have our NGOs, we all have our role in the public sector. That inspiration and, what sort of things would you like to see coming from Anthropy? Because Anthropy is a small organization. It can't do much, but the inspiration you create can do an awful lot.
Yes. Well, you're absolutely right. We're not a delivery organization in terms of going beyond the event. So we don't drive campaigns, we don't build new partnerships and things of that kind, because actually, for a couple of reasons, because of my reputation in the first year, people were asking me to do exactly that. I was asked to create an Anthropy schools mentoring program. There was no need. I've actually created 2 of those in the past for the Prince of Wales. They're still out there doing it. I was asked to create an Anthropy ex-offenders employment program. There's no need. They're out there. So what we do at Anthropy is really showcase the very best of those examples, as well as businesses and what they're doing, and also the exploratory thinking about the future of leadership in this country. So I had to really be adamant that we were the platform, we were the channel for that inspiration. I see change happening in 3 specific ways, and I'm continually pleased and surprised when people explain the impact that Anthropy has had either on themselves individually or on the organizations and things they're associated with. But when I looked at it, there were 3 things. The first was that it would be a catalyst to changing practices in organizations. So if you imagine, if you are sitting in the audience as a business leader, or indeed a leader of any organization, public sector or otherwise, and you happen to be listening to people such as Timpson's here in the UK, they do a lot on the employment of ex-offenders, for example. And you're sitting there and you think, well, we've never looked at that. Something potentially that might fill our gap in terms of our ability to recruit, but it would also be a positive contribution to society. Then hopefully they might go away, learn more about the way in which these initiatives work and change the practices internally. Because a lot of companies still have a box when on applications for jobs. They say, do you have a criminal record? And if people tick that box, they never get an interview. So there are simple changes in practices that might be inspired in that way. That's practices. The second is that Anthropy is a place where new partnerships are formed. And those partnerships fall into a couple of different categories. We have had instances where several partners will be talking about what they're doing. So you might have a business and a non-profit in partnership on a particular initiative. It might be around net zero or something like that. They will be talking about it. And then what happens is people in the audience then go and join that partnership afterwards. They choose that they were inspired by that. That's how we'll channel our efforts. But equally, we've had people meet at Anthropy who have then gone on to do partnering activities. So it's a great catalyst for finding new partners in some shape or form. And then the third element is actually how we influence policymakers and politicians. Now, Anthropy is an extraordinarily broad church. I have within the constituency of what we call anthropists. And of course, we only may have around 2,000 or so people attend 3 days. But on our media channels, we now have something well over 25,000 followers in 3 years on all the channels. So we're influencing in a wider context. But when it comes to policy, we cannot advocate specific policies because it would alienate some part of our constituency. We have, for example, staunch Remainers, we have staunch Brexiteers, we have passionate campaigners for net zero, we have people that have a different view about climate change. They're all part of Britain and they have to be part of that conversation. But what we can do is to get politicians and senior civil servants and public leaders, so those that, for example, run regulators and things of that kind, to come down and partake in conversations with people they otherwise wouldn't meet. And in that way, we hope have a softer, gentler approach to influencing the agenda, which is why we obviously have politicians there and we work hard with the government at all levels and public sector organisations to get them as part of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know from my own personal experience of going to Anthropy for both of the previous two, you find yourselves having conversations with people from completely different perspectives, you know, the mayor of Plymouth, or you get out of your little world and it opens your mind to new thinking. And, you know, I personally have enjoyed it. And, you know, huge thank you for creating it. And I'd sort of like to wish you every success with Anthropy 3. I know it's building to be quite an amazing event.
I mean, thank you for that, Dave, and thank you for Brand Pie's continued support, which is critical to our success. I mean, to give people a sense of scale, we will, in March, have 230 sessions over about 20 stages with over 600 speakers. And a lot of
Incredible.
Basically are just part of the audience. So, you know, you will find yourself sitting in the audience next to significant public figures. And that's what people find quite extraordinary. And I think, if you go back to your other point, I mean, I love alliteration, which is why it's practices, partnerships, and policymakers. But actually, the fourth P, which I didn't really identify until after the first event, was the impact that it has personally on people. And I recall one CEO of one global company, he's the CEO of the UK part of a global company, who came down in year 1. And, he said to me afterwards, I'd never actually met him. I'd not met him beforehand, and I'd not actually met him at the event. But afterwards, I arranged a call. And he said to me, John, before I start, I just want to explain to you that I had purchased a ticket to come down. And when it got nearer the event, I thought, why am I going to this? It's far away. We've had a tough time in the business over the summer. I really could do without this. We've got real challenges, et cetera, et cetera. But he said, I bought the train ticket. I've got the accommodation booked. He thought, I'll go down. I can come back after the first day if it's not worth it. He said, John, I went down. He said, there's one word I'll describe it. It was transformational. Transformational. And he said it was transformational because I needed personally to be inspired, to see positivity, to get a sense that there was opportunities in the country, etc., etc. And I went in and heard these extraordinary people from all different walks of life, as you were saying, talking in those terms, not blind to the issues, but with new innovative ideas. He said, so it transformed the way I felt personally. But he said it also gave me ideas which meant that I came back to the business and transformed my approach to actually tackling some of the issues that we were still having. And he said, and that's the key word that I'd give you about Anthropy. And I was really, struck by that.
No, I mean, you can't go to Anthropy and you will come away inspired and with 3 or 4 ideas that you want to do. And I know from my own firm, we've developed with you the Emerging Leaders Program, which has been phenomenal for me and our people, and the people who are on the Emerging Leaders Program. And it's been absolutely terrific. And, I can see you are inspiring a better Britain, which is just an incredible place to be in society. We're coming to the sort of the end of the time period, and we always sort of end with a fun fact. And this one's more about me than you, but it's about you as well. But I don't know if you remember, but many, many years ago when LinkedIn was just kicking off, you were the first person that ever wrote to me on LinkedIn and said, "It looks like we have things in common. Shall we have a coffee?" And that was a little mini pivotal moment in my life. Meeting you and having a coffee and starting to understand how that technology was going to, enable us. But it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and wish you every success with Anthropy. And for those who are listening, if you're not there, get yourself there. It's just brilliant.
Well, Dave, thank you very much for that plug, and thank you for the opportunity. I'd say, yes, you're reminding me about LinkedIn, which obviously that was that sort of opportunity to reach out. I have to say, there are others that say they made the mistake of sitting next to me on an airplane or on a train. It's cost them a fortune over the years, but they still talk, They still come. So there's something going to be right in that.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you, John.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about BrandPie and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brandpie.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.